Hello everyone, I welcome you to CEC lecture series. I am Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. And this series is a new one where we talk about the form of the short story, and of course, we discuss different short stories as well. There have been other lectures in this series which is recently begun, and today's lecture talks about the short story development and form. So, as we understand that in literature, you see there are different styles of writing, there are different genres, prose, drama, poetry, etc. Short story, of course, we all understand is part of prose, and it's a short prose, right? And we also know that every form of expression or every style of expression in literature has its own aesthetic, its own manner of functioning, and of course then different writers then follow that logic, and we notice that form a lot of times also does have an impact on the way something is communicated. So in this series we go closer in order to understand that how does a short story operate. We will look at different examples of different short stories spanning across different decades, and what is the uniqueness of the form of the form of the short story as it is kind of handled by different authors. So that's what is going to be in discussion. So today let us begin with first posing the very fundamental question that what is a short story. So if we look at it literally, the literal interpretation of course is quite basic, that story, which is of course short in length. But of course it is once we go into a technical definition and once we go into the nuances of the idea, then of course we understand that there are a lot of other parameters also which are at work here. So what is a short story? Let's look at this definition which is given by M.H. Abrams. He says, and I quote, "A short story is a brief work of prose fiction, and most of the terms for analyzing the component elements, the types and the narrative techniques of the novel are applicable to short stories," unquote. So what do we notice over here? That in his definition itself, M.H. Abrams has drawn a comparison or a parallel between short story and the novel form. Of course, most obviously because novel is a longer prose, while short story is limited in its range and length. So we see that the first half of the definition says that it's a brief work of prose fiction, right? So which itself establishes the an idea of the brevity of its length, and of course then its scope. And then the second half of the definition says that most of the terms which are used for which are relevant for the novel, right, and which are the component elements of a novel, the types and the narrative techniques which all are used in the context of a novel are all applicable to the short stories, right? And the next thing which comes to our mind is that what exactly are these component elements of the novel which can also be found in the short stories, right? That's the first question which arises from this definition itself. So if you look at this, the elements of a novel in the short stories can be categorized into four broader categories: the plot, characters, events and milieu, right? So we see that just like a novel, a short story also has a plot, it has characters, it has events, and there is a milieu. And we also see that short fiction organizes thought, action and dialogue into artful pattern of a plot. Now this is another element which is kind of common to both the forms of expression. Now if we see that plot, what do we mean by that? Plot is different sequence of events which are interconnected in the form of a particular pattern, right? Now that is there in the novel, and it's also present in the short story too, that there are some events which make up the narrative, and those events are arranged in a way that there is some logic, there is some pattern which connects those events. Now you might wonder, what do we mean by this logic or pattern? Things like there could be a reversal, there could be that event 2 is a reversal from event 1, or event 2 contradicts event 1, or event 2 leads to a further explanation of event 1, or adds more information to the events which have happened before. So that's what we mean by logic or a pattern, right? So therefore, when we talk about plot, that's what we are dealing with, be it in a short story or in a novel. Likewise, there are of course characters. Characters in a novel, similarly we have characters even in the short story. There are events which make up the plot, and we said milieu. Now what is milieu? Milieu is the backdrop or the context against which different events take place, right? So it could be a particular village. So when we talk about the backdrop as well, multiple things come into the picture. First is, what is the time frame? When is the action taking place, or when are the events located? Second, where? Where are they located? What country? Is it a village? Is it a city? Is it a town? Right? So when and where are very important, and of course the what. That what is happening at the time when these events are, or where these events are situated. So all these together form the milieu of a given text. So we see that all these aspects are common to the short story as well as the novel, and that's why short story is a brief fiction as compared to the longer form, which is the novel. Now the other element of definition by M.H. Abrams, of short stories definition by M.H. Abrams, he says that apart from the component elements of the novel which are common to a short story, there are also some narrative techniques of the novel in the short stories which can be traced, right? So not just the component elements, but even the narrative techniques are common to the both forms. Now one might ask here, what do we mean by narrative techniques? If you just look at the word itself, narrative technique. So technique means the method or the way that you adopt in order to execute something. So what are the tools that you are using? What is the method that you are adopting in order to narrativize something? So broadly stating, that's what narrative techniques is. That's what narrative techniques are. Now they can deal with plot. Narrative technique also has the element of point of view, it has the element of characters, it has the element of mode, etc. Right? It's a very broad term. So let's first understand these 4 elements of narrative techniques, which is plot, points of view, characters and mode. Now these 4 things again are present in a short story, just like we have them in the novel. So when we talk about the plot, there are different kinds of plot that an author might want to create. One such is cliffhanger, right? So cliffhanger means where your narrative ends in an unresolved situation, in an unanswered situation. That is what is a cliffhanger. That the reader doesn't really get a decisive answer or a decisive closure to whatever was going on in the narrative. Likewise, another kind of a plot would involve a flashback. Now, what is a flashback? We all know, because we've also seen it in a lot of kind of films. So this narrative technique is used not only in writing novels but also films, right? So flashback is where the narrative carries a view into the past as well. So past is brought back into the present, and both stand in some kind of a conversation. So that is another technique, narrative technique, which is used vis-a-vis the plot, which is flashback. Another such technique which is again connected with plot, is the frame story. Now, what do we mean by the word frame story? It means, as the word itself suggests, that there is a frame, or there is an outer, structuring agent. Within that, there is another story. So, you see, what does the word frame mean? You see, a frame always borders a picture, right? And within that is the picture. So, similarly, when you have a frame story or a frame narrative, it means that there will be, very simply put, a story within a story, right? So, there would be multiple narrators, there would be multiple characters who are part of each stories, right? So, this is yet another narrative technique which an author might use for the construction of a plot in a short story or in a novel, right? So, this is one segment of narrative techniques which pertain to the plot. If we go to the next one, which is points of view. Now, this is another important element in a narrative. After plot, points of view is another important concept which we need to understand in order to appreciate a narrative. Points of view means that from what standpoint is the narrative being told. Most fundamentally, you see, we talk about 3 points of views: the first person, second person, and third person point of view. First person is where the person who actually experienced those events talks about them firsthand, and that becomes part of the narrative. That's the first person. The second person point of view is where, in fact, second person is not very common, but third person is where most in most cases you have an omniscient narrator, somebody who is observing the goings on, right? So that is a third person point of view. So that's how you see the choice by a author here then on the basis of the point of view also decides what narrative technique the author chooses to take in order to construct a novel or a short story. Likewise, there are techniques pertaining to characters as well. First such technique is hamartia. Now, what do we mean by hamartia? Hamartia means that there is a tragic flaw in the character, and that tragic flaw leads to a certain series of events in the narrative. Okay. Likewise, another such technique connected with characterization is anthropomorphism. Now, what do we mean by anthropomorphism? It means that kind of endowing human-like qualities to non-human entities. So now that also is explored widely in a lot of texts of fiction, right? There are allegories, we see where values are personified, right? So we notice that human values are given to the non-human entities, right? So that is another technique of characterization which involves anthropomorphism. A fourth technique in a narrative pertains to the mode of the narrative, right? So within mode, an author might choose between fantasy, realism, naturalism, etc. So this then provides yet another set of choices in front of the narrator or the author of the short fiction, short story, or the novel, which is fantasy. So mode means that what is the mode in which the narrative is being told. Fantasy means of course that there is going to be an extensive use of imagination. Things will happen in the narrative which might not also have a direct parallel in the kind of reality that we encounter every day, and by means of fantasy then the author is able to convey a lot of those things which might be missing in the current reality. So that's the fantastic mode or the mode of fantasy. Likewise, there's realism. That's still another mode, which means that you communicate the point keeping in mind the reality, and you represent reality in its complexity. That is the crux, that you represent reality in its complexity. And when I say complexity, it means that you have an eye, or the author has an eye, on the gaps in the present or in the reality. He is also equally aware of the potentialities which lie in the reality, and which can, be when tapped or when realized, it can better human condition. So approaching reality in such a comprehensive way is what we understand by realism, or the realistic mode. Yes, and of course Lukács has talked about it at length, and I wouldn't like to go into it at a detail as such, but as Lukács says, that it's a totality that comes to us in realism, a totality of experience. That there is a reason for why characters behave a certain way in a certain kind of reality, right? And reality always has its own logic, and it is headed in a certain way. So when the author is able to see these patterns and represent them in fiction, in the narrative, that's when we say that he is using the mode of realism. The last one is naturalism. Of course, not the last, but one of the, I would say, representative techniques which is to do with mode is naturalism. Naturalism, where the author presents, the milieu, or all that he is representing as it is, without any change, without any, insight into what happened in the past, what could be in the future, not indicating any of these patterns, but just presenting life as it is, or presenting reality as it is. That is what is the naturalist mode. So you see, we notice all these narrative techniques which are common between the novel and the short story. So we can say that these elements of the novel are also evident in the short story. It will have a plot with all these different variations. It will have points of views. There will be characters, and characters constructed differently on the basis of the particular technique that a author might choose to pick up, and of course a mode as well. So we've already seen that how the form of the short story has these elements which it shares with its longer form of the counterpart, right, which is there in the novel. Now we have of course seen and quite at length the similarities between the two forms, the long form of prose and the short form or the short fiction. And we've established that how the definitions in that sense to an extent reinforce each other. But at the same time, one must also feel, one must also question and think that if there are these common elements, but at the end of the day, there are these two are two distinct means of expression. Novel is not a short story, and neither is the otherwise. So what are the points of differences then between these two forms of expression? That's the second question which we come to. And the foremost thing, which I also to an extent did establish, is that its length. Short story will be shorter in length, of course, right? And because of that, the magnitude is also going to differ. In short story, that magnitude would not be as vast or expansive, because the scope of the story is shorter as compared to a novel. And a third thing we say is that after length and magnitude, that even the impacts of both the first two factors, they come together to impact the choice and elaboration of elements used to achieve narrative effects. The elements that we just now discussed, right, the plot, the character, the point of view, etc., the choice of these and the elaboration on each of these depends on or differs or is impacted by the length of the short story, which is of course shorter as compared to the novel. So even as those elements are common, but how are those elements, how elaborately explained or how elaborately used are those elements? That is what makes the difference between a story or a short story and a novel, right? So for instance, like a character who is experiencing hamartia, that hamartia, the element of hamartia may not be so well kind of developed as compared to a novel form, right? So we notice this difference between the two styles of writing. So in this lecture, what we have noticed is A, we have discussed the definition of short story as given by Image Abrams. From there, we elaborated upon three things. First, the idea of length of the prose fiction. Second, we have elaborated upon the narrative elements which are common to the novel and the short story. Third, we have also looked at the component elements and of course the narrative techniques, these two things, the component elements, the narrative techniques, and finally we also discussed that where do these two forms of expression differ, right? In the next half of the lecture, we are going to carry forward our discussion and further build on the concept of the short story and also understand how did it come into being and where and how did it develop as a form of expression. Thank you.